Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Natalie De Silva, and I'm the chairman of the Johannesburg branch of the Genealogical Society. Our speaker today is Nigel Walker, who immigrated to South Africa from London in 1982. He worked at CSIR with the Air Pollution Unit, and then as marketing manager for the Water Technology Department. He left CSIR to start up his own business in eventing and exhibitions. But since his early teens, Nigel has spent hours and hours in cold, drafty churches, long before the likes of FamilySearch.org came into being. But his fascination started when his grandfather said that the Walker family began in the time of the French Revolution, when an orphan was rescued and raised by a Dr. Walker. With this single sentence, Nigel's lengthy journey into family history began. Many breaks, twists, and turns later, and his journey is still far from finished. Nigel's research is greatly expanded from simple birth, marriage, and death records to viewing the same information, but in the social, political, industrial, and economic developments that affect his ancestral history. We look forward to learning from you, Nigel, about how you've done that, and over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Alta, for hosting all of these branch meetings. Much appreciated, I'm sure, by all. When Natalie asked me if I'd do a talk, and I accepted with a bit of trepidation, my focus is maybe much broader sources than we typically use for family research. And as Natalie said, what I do like trying to do is add character and flesh to the bones. So when I first started out mapping out the talk, it was quite interesting to me how the talk has developed. Right, so in general, we often all use Ancestry or Find My Past and Family Search. Some are subscription-based, some are free. I also use the National Archives. I don't often use MyHeritage. And I do use quite often the local county record offices that are available online, particularly for the catalogues. I do find the record offices very useful in going about things, but there's a lot more other sources. So for example, National Archives at the moment, and you'll maybe sometimes see it abbreviated as the TNA, although you have to register, every download now currently is still free. It has been for the last 2 years. I would recommend, if you have time, looking at what's on the National Archives. Do not only think that they pertain to the UK. Obviously, the passenger lists. Last week, I accessed the naturalization indexes from just after 1800 to 1900, and I've downloaded that PDF file. Although it says add to basket, and you often think that means money, it doesn't in this case. You can add it to the basket, and then the basket is 0. And then you can proceed to download those PDF files. It is very useful. The typical birth, marriages, and deaths and census records, there's on mine left, I'm not sure what it shows on the screen, but my left is my birth certificate in East Retford, which is in Nottinghamshire in the centre of England. There's my mum and dad's marriage certificate, 1954. In Stockton-on-Tees, which is the northeast, Middlesbrough, Stockton. That would be my dad's, on the left-hand side, my dad's birth certificate, which would give the address, the name, the date, and the parents, Sydney Bartondale and Olga Mary Walker. It obviously does help tremendously when you have names which are unusual. Sydney Bartondale, there are not many Sydney Bartondale in the Walkers, although there are many Walkers, which helps tremendously. And then I have Sydney Bartondale's, my grandfather's marriage certificate, 1925, and it was in the British consulate in Le Havre. in France. The other piece of information I have with Sidney Bartendale is the 1911 census, which shows him and Mary and my dad and his brother in 1911 in Bristol. As I say, my talk it will illustrate. I'm not going to do a family dive in detail on the family. It is illustrative. So where those last few slides shows is a timeline, and I've tried to map it out on England, where from Bristol, where my grandfather was born in 1911, married in 1925 in Le Havre, my dad's birth in 1930 in Wembley in London, 1930s moved up to Nottingham, and the 1970s in Hythe in Hampshire. Prior to that, I've added for interest that the 1950s in Derbyshire in the centre of the UK, and for the birth is Paris in France. That would typically be the type of information you would get and the timelines that you would get by using the traditional sources. What I've done is use a whole set of what I call non-traditional sources to expand on that information. So we have the 1939 register, the voters and electoral rolls, telephone book, trade directories. I've used Google Street View, pages of houses, estate agent listings, Google Books, passenger listings, eBay, and you can see the rest of the things. Many of these may not be considered or may not spring to mind in doing research. I found them very useful, and I've certainly found them very useful in providing substance to pure dates. I'm going to assume if anybody's got any questions or thoughts, I have no problems with answering them as they come up, or we can take them at the end later on. 1939 register is a very, very useful resource. I think most people would know about the 1939 register. Next year, at the moment, they're only saying early, but January, February, March, the 1922 census will be released on Find My Past. It will probably be at an additional cost to your normal subscription. But the 1922 census is going to be the last census for some time, because 1931 census was destroyed in the Second World War, and the 1941 census was not undertaken. So the next census for the UK will probably be in the 1951 census, released in 2052, which for many of us is a long way away. But the 1939 population register is a useful resource. It bridges a gap, and it's accessible, although at a cost. It captures every detail of all civilian populations in England and Wales. It was taken on the 29th of September and was used on the basis for identity cards, ration books, conscription, etc. It excluded military personnel, but contains the details of 42,000 million people. What's different about the register is that compared with censuses, it shows the exact dates of birth. It's not just to the nearest year. And what it looks like, I'm sure on here, this is my grandfather, Sidney Bartendale, Sidney B. There's Olga Mary, my grandmother. There's the address, 9 North Road. There's the full date of birth. Now, that is unusual when you compare to other census returns. Normally, they only give an age or the year of the birth. Here, it gives the full date of birth. It gives the occupation. And there's my dad, Jeffrey Douglas. Again, it's very helpful when you have rather unusual names. The same as Nigel. Right now, Nigel was a popular name in the 1950s. Over the last 2 years, as far as I know, there's not been a single Nigel registered at birth in the UK. So that name is, well, literally and figuratively dying out until it becomes fashionable again. What's interesting for this is that the blacked out record there is not because it's some officially secret, it's because that's my dad's brother. And at the time that the records went online, he was still alive. He was still under the 100 Years rule. which unfortunately happened a couple of years ago, has not been notified to the register, and therefore it's still assumed that he's alive. It can happen that an ancestor is blacked out like that. What is interesting there is that for my grandfather, he was born in 1899. So at this time, he was 40 years old. He wasn't eligible for the army, so you can see his occupation. But he was in West Bridgford, which is part of Nottingham, he was an air raid warden. So although it gives his occupation, it also gives additional information. 1939 register, very useful indeed. Like Natalie said, I do like adding information to my family research and the notes on the family research. So I've actually talked through this. I would, for example, in my notes, I air raid wardens, posters, etc., from the time. I add those to my research. I've got my grandfather's pin as being an air raid warden. I still have that. As a sideline, this is from the newspapers. I use other sources to build on things. This is from an air raid in 1941. The Luftwaffe raided Nottingham and Derby. Nottingham and Derby was the location for the Rolls-Royce engine manufacturing work, which they were obviously trying to target. They used beams set up on the coast of Europe, and the bombers would fly along the beams, and where the crossover point would be where they should release their bomb. The RAF countermeasured that by anti-beam, I don't know what you would like to call it, technology, and diverted many of the raids to the northeast of Nottingham and Derby, so the bombs would fall outside of the town. But the newspaper cuttings of the time gave the location of the bombs, the dot on there, and you can see how the city centre was hit. My grandfather, 9 North Road, is there. So the bombing missed my grandfather's house, but certainly you can see from newspapers the effect that the bombing would have. And you can also see, I think you can see linear bombing runs. You can imagine the bombing coming down that street like that. Must be, like in any conflict, terrifying. As an aside, the first house I purchased in Barking in East London, again, that would have been a target, East London and the docks. The first house I had still had its air raid shelter erected in the back, and I'm not that old. We purchased the house in the 1970s, and the air raid shelter still exists. So going back and referencing a talk from 2-3 months ago, you'll see that in the newspapers, they talk about the Masons Hall was damaged, was hit. My grandfather was also a Mason in Nottingham. So what I've now do is an illustration. I can now add from the 1939 register, I can add an address to my timeline in the 30s. I can fix the timeline. The electoral rolls, voter rolls. In South Africa, the society's doing their own scanning of two of the voters' rolls. The voter rolls are available online, but they do exist in many county registers. Online, 125 million individuals are on the electoral registers from 1920 to 1932. It includes all those who are first entitled to vote after 1918. Importantly, it's an ongoing digitization project. Like our own in South Africa, it is, if you think that the electoral registers are updated annually, it's a big project. The British Library has a collection of all the printed electoral registers from 1932. It indicates the names of people who are entitled to vote. So it's not a register of all individuals, as in 1939, and in the census returns. It only lists those who are entitled to vote. There are gaps. There were no registers produced during the First World War, in the middle center of the First World War, or in the middle of the World War II. There are, through ancestries, limited periods of time where you can see it. Also through Find My Past, and I'm going to not repeat myself, you can read that. Typically, here's Find My Past. If you go to the electoral registers, there it's 1920 to 1932, and it has the 125 million people. You can also see the directors of companies, etc. Further on down, you can see electoral registers from 1780. There are scattered other county records. Same as in Ancestry, you can see numbers and dates that they're covered. What would you expect out of the voters' roll? How did it help me? I looked at the 1926 and 27 voters' roll for Wembley. This is where my dad was born, in Wembley, so it gives you there. Right down here, I've got Olga Mary Walker, Sydney Bartondale Walker. There's obviously no ages. There is an address, Morstead Street, and it gives you the number. Resided at 5 Morstead Street. They shared the address with Charles and Agnes Hawes. You'll see my grandfather could vote in parliamentary elections through his residency and in local government through his occupational qualification. These things are not constant. It does depend on the status of the individual. My grandmother could vote in elections due to her husband's occupation. It's very easy not to think that, or to think that the present eligibility for everybody to vote has been in place forever and a day. It's not actual. You have to understand and appreciate that this has changed over time. It was only 99 years ago, 90 whatever years ago, that women were allowed to vote after for this in 1929. So you won't find women, most women, unless they're proper. There are a few exceptions. In 1918, women, I'm going to say regained, I've said regained, the right to vote. Originally, 1932, male persons could vote. Women lost their right to vote in 1835. Before that, they could. Unmarried women regained that right to vote in 1869, and by 1900 1 million women were able to register to vote. So it's not true to say that all women couldn't vote. Some women did appear in the register, but it would be under specific circumstances. And this is when I talk to my grandchildren and we talk about family history, particularly with the young girls, my grandgirls, women's rights and suffragettes has not always been the same. South Africa, you can see my note down the bottom here. The first general election in which women could vote was 1933 election, but Asian and women of color could not gain that until 1983. So what I can now do, I can add to my summary of Sydney Bartondale Walker details of 1926 to 1927. He was in Wembley in Middlesex, which adds to my timelines and detail. Next category of what I would call is unusual research aids are phone books. The British phone book has been published since 1880, and every phone book is there at British Telecom Archive. 1,780 phone books. So if one of your ancestors or a person of interest you're researching had a telephone, there is a very good chance that they actually appear in a telephone directory. Ancestry provides the telephone directories online. I found it very useful to use the browse function as opposed to the search function. When you can find, if you know the person of interest is in Nottingham, you can just home in on Nottingham, and then browsing lets you browse to the W section and find Walkers. So in 1937's telephone directory, I can find, and as I said, it's very useful to have initials where Sydney Bartondale, my grandfather, always used Sydney Bartondale, SB, as his initials. I've not found a record where he only talks about Sydney. My father normally used Geoffrey Douglas, whereas interestingly enough, my middle name's Peter. I very rarely use my middle name. So you will only ever see Nigel Walker. You won't see Nigel Peter Walker. But once you've found, and moving from the known to the unknown, once I know what WB is, West Bridgeford and Nottingham. Once I know where he is, there he is in Nottingham. That's his telephone number. And I can then move on to 1938 to 55. Over all those years, there's the same telephone number because you kept your phone number, but he then moved to 9 North Road, West Bridgeford, from 55 Selby Road. I knew that at some stage my grandfather moved to Nottingham, Tranbury Gardens. I can remember visiting them and having a holiday in Woollerton. And I know through the telephone book, and this is the only source of information, I knew that he then moved to 46 Tranbury Gardens, and he appears in the telephone directories 1956 to 72. I also knew at some stage my grandfather moved down to Hythe in Hampshire in the New Forest to be close to my father, 27 Ashley Close. But if I look in the phone books, I can actually know that he appeared 1975 to 1981 in the phone book. Remember, the phone books aren't regulated. You can look up, you can see a phone book. There's no 100-year rule. There's no 30-year rule on phone books. I would 100% agree that it's very difficult if you don't have a unique name. But once you found, in this case, Sidney Bartondale, you can see how I've been able to trace him from 1937 to 1981 through the use of the phone books. And I find it interesting that in 1975, in the Southampton phone book, I can find both my dad at 67 Heatherstone Avenue in the 1975 phone book, and on the same page down the bottom here, I've got my grandfather at 27 Ashley Close. I know from personal experience, but you could also use Google Maps then to see the address and the distance between the two places. So I can now, on my timeline, I can now add further details to my grandfather's timeline. I can add 75 to 81. Well, that would be wrong, but Ashley Close. 56 to 72 is Tranby Gardens. In West Bridgeford, 38 to 1955. And then West Bridgeford in 55 Selby Road, 37. So through the use of the telephone books, which I would call are a non-traditional resource, I've been able to add quite a significant amount of data regarding my grandfather. And remember, though, it covers the whole country. And I think in the latter part of after the war, certainly telephones became, as I could well imagine, telephones being a household item far more than a washing machine, for example, in the early 50s. In South Africa, I just Googled this. As Natalie says, I don't have a lot of expertise, knowledge of South Africa. I don't have South African ancestries. I do have some descendants. I have a son and a daughter, and I have some grandchildren now. But the South African telephone started in 1878. I just Googled this. You can often see the references I put down at the bottom of the page. And the first telephone exchange was in Port Elizabeth in 1882. I cannot verify this details. I've got this from the National Archives, the South African National Archives. They tell me that every telephone directory, every pub printed in South Africa since 1910 reside in the Telkom archives. I obviously think telephone directories are very useful. I think if you've lost your family, not lost, that's an inappropriate word, but if you can't find your family in the Transvaal or the Free State, actually looking in a telephone directory may give you a lot of clues to where that family is. If a family member has moved from the family into somewhere else, I think telephone directories are a good and easily usable resource to look for where the relative, where the brother or sister moved to, etc. I don't think telephone books should be overlooked. From telephone books, I'm going to go to trade directories. Trade directories provide a lot of detailed information. They are trade, they're a business. They're not a census return of everybody. If you have a ancestor or an individual you're interested in, but they weren't a shopkeeper, it wouldn't list a shop assistant. But if the person was a trader, a manager, a shop owner, a merchant, they would probably be listed in one or the other trade directory. The trade directories were compiled by competing companies, commercial companies. So you see Kelly's, Wood, Wright. There are many, many different compilers. The Kelly's telephone directories were actually I don't know what you would like to call this, a collaboration would be a good word, between Kelly's and the post office. Kelly's used the post office and the post office delivery guys to compile the trade directories. Trade directories could be published annually or every 2 years or sometimes every 3 years, but they do exist, for example, in Derbyshire from the 1790s to the 1941s. So I, again, would then take from the telephone directories, go to the trade directory. And you can see here, in my case, I've used Thomas Walker, who arrived in 1850 in Derbyshire, and in somewhere around 1881 in the census, it starts referring to Thomas as a coal merchant. And thereafter, he became 1881, 1891, 1901, he was quite a successful coal merchant. In 1851, 61, and 71, he was a servant. So as a servant, he would not be listed in trade directories. But if you find a person of interest in the censuses, and there are, as I say, a business owner, a trader, a merchant, or a banker, or some profession, there's a good chance that you will find them in one or the other trade directory. And the fact that these trade directories were compiled annually and that there are multiple different compilers, be it Kelly's or whatever, you can find different listings in many years. In 1881, in any directory, you may find 3 references to one individual, because I can find my Thomas Walker by the street at 111 Nottingham Road as a coal merchant. He's also listed under coal merchants at 111 Nottingham Road, Thomas Walker. So if you were looking for a coal merchant by profession, I can find him listed there. By street, he's under 111 Nottingham Road. And you can also there see he was sharing that premises with a James Holland and a Thomas Summerside. But I can also find him at his home address, for want of a better word, as his residence at 32 Duffield Road. And there he is, Thomas Walker. I know that's Thomas because from the 1881 census, that's the address in the 1891 and 1881 census, 32 Duffield Road. So trade directories often have multiple listings for the same trade directory for the same individual. As I say, trade directories, 1881, directory for Kelly's in 1881, there's the thing. In 1876, Kelly's gave it as a resident, coal merchant in Nottingham Road. And in 1874, I've got Thomas in 32 Duffield Road, coal merchants, 9 Nottingham Road. The 1871 census, I have his address as in 90 Friars Gate. He was a valet, he was a servant. I would not expect him, therefore, to be in any trade directories. And for example, in Harold's 1870, I can't find him. I wouldn't have expected to have him, but he's not there. My current search is for bridging that gap from 74 to 71. When did he become a coal merchant? And one of the sources, and that's where I'm working on. Trade directories in the UK apart from ancestry, find my path, past, etc. Leicester University has an extensive digitized listing of trade directories per county. These are there, you can download them, you can click it, you can download the whole and it's free of charge. It doesn't cost you anything to download these directories. So you can use Ancestry. You can also use Family Search. I know there's a couple there on Family Search, but Leicester has an extensive collection of these trade directories. Well worth visiting that site. Trade directories in South Africa, as I say, I don't have a lot of experience on that. Family Search has some trade directories. You can see the film numbers here. Thank you, Natalie, for the reference. And just like the UK ones, we can find individuals. As I say, I'm also, for part of my family, my daughter married a Gunningham. And in 1942, I've got 3 Gunningham brothers. In the 1942 trade directory, it gives the Gunningham brothers and it gives all of their addresses. Now, I'm not sure that without trade directories, how in 1942, how you would find details of individuals. My experience would be is do not forget to look at the trade directory. In the intervening year, I think this is, I can't remember the date of this one here, but you'll see there's the Gunningham, there's 2 Gunningham brothers, and it also then now gives Gunningham brothers as a company, and it gives a different address. And there's the Gunningham brothers in 1954 in Denver, and the 2 brothers, Herbert and Walter, you can find. So I managed to bridge over a decade of records for the Gunningham family through the use of a trade directory. Useful resource, don't forget it. Google Street View. I don't know if I'm not sure that many of us would think of, well, Google as a resource, and many of us would think of Google Street View as a resource for family research. Bear in mind that I like to illustrate my research via maps, migration, etc. Google Street View, it's useful to have an idea of housing styles. So when you look at a house on a street view, when was that house, which era was that house built in? In the UK, obviously, we've talked about the effects of the Blitz on the UK. Many houses were destroyed, many suburbs were destroyed and rebuilt. There was also post-war a lot of development where terraced housing was knocked down and rebuilt into, I wanted to use the word modern. Modern is modern, but it's always relative to the era you're living in. So it's useful to have pictures of houses. It's no different from when you're trying to identify that old photograph of in the 1800s where you look at fashion and layout to try to identify how old the house is. It's useful to have an idea of the type of house that was built in each era. So I can go Street View, I can Google on Street View 5 Milstead Avenue, Wembley, and I'm going to use the word location, was the residence of my grandfather 1926 to 27. When you go back to the house, that is not a house from 1926. 1930s, that is not a house from the 1930s. But it's interesting to see those. If you go through 1937, 55 Selby, West Bridgeford, it's difficult to tell, but maybe that would be. But this house here where he lived in 9 North Road, West Bridgeford, 1938 to 55, that is an original house. That may not be the original tree, I hasten to add, but I could picture in my mind, and I can illustrate my family history through Google Street View with that is the house my grandfather and grandmother originally owned in 1938, or lived in. Let me not use the word owned, resided in. So that's how I use Google Street View. That's Tranby Gardens that I can remember visiting for my grandfather in Woollerton. That would have been the original house, and that is, the paving's different. My grandmother was an avid collector of heather from the moors. She had a great extensive collection of heather and used to grow it. I can remember it. And when they moved down south to Hampshire, this is their bungalow they had. And there you can see the remnants, the pictures of the heather collection. She brought the heathers down from Nottingham down to Hampshire. So when they moved to be closer to my grandfather and my father, that she brought down her heather collection. And I like illustrating my family history documentation rather than just looking at births, marriages, and deaths certificates. And when you look at 1975, that's nigh on 50 years ago. So it's still pertinent today. Ages of houses, you can see what's available publicly in the UK is interesting. 55 Selby Road. Anybody can use this. And online up pops, the form of the house is semi-detached. You can see that it's a house there and there's a neighbor there. The year built, 1930, 1949. It is possible that's the original house. You have to look through Google View. You can look down the whole row of the street. You can see if that was a bombed out house, because then maybe the style of house was different. And you can see if you want even greater details, you can pay £3 and believe it or not, you will get the deed documents for that house. There's Tranby Gardens in Woollerton, as I say, semi-detached, it gives you the details. And let me take you back one step, Google Street View. Here we are again looking at Gunningham. They emigrated in 1906, 1908 from the UK to South Africa. If I use Street View, I can see, okay, the photograph was taken in February 2015, the 101 Gordon Road. That was a residence that Percy Gunningham lived here in 1913. And I say to most people, that looks like the original house. Yes, obviously the roof's been repaired, but you can see, you compare that house to the neighboring house, how the neighboring house is newer looking, whereas that house looks more like the original. 1915, 91 Gordon Road. This is Percy Gunningham. Yeah, I can picture Percy, and that would have been his house. And then in 1918, 25 First Avenue, Bez Valley, there. You don't have to visit Bez Valley if you are in Cape Town. You can use Google Street View to get you might be lucky. Sometimes you're not. It might have been all redeveloped, but you don't have to go and stand in that street and take a photograph of a house that your potential ancestor lived in. And remember, Street View goes all over the world. Estate agent listings. It's interesting. Most houses are sold at some stage or other. Very few houses remain in a family unsold for decades and decades and decades. If, for example, I look at one of the other houses, Tranby Gardens, I can pull up when it was sold. I can often see details of that house. You can see how many bathrooms it is. I can remember my grandfather on my mother's side, they were from Middlesbrough in Stockton. When I visited them as a young child, I can remember the outside toilet. I can remember the bath being in a very large kitchen, and there was a wooden table which was pivoted against the wall. That table was the food preparation, the countertop, call it what you would like. But if you hoisted it up by a pulley system, there was the bath. In 1950, I call him my Thomas Walker, married Diana Copnell in Barton Blout, which is in the centre of Derbyshire. He's a servant. His father's recorded as unknown. And at the moment, I'll come back to that. Both were residing in Barton Blout in the hall. And I can, through an estate listing, because the hall was sold a couple of years ago, there's a whole and apologies to anybody who is an estate agent, obviously you can read through what I would call estate agent romanticizing how nice this house is, manor. Maybe more importantly, I can see inside the manor. There's a kitchen. I can imagine my Thomas, he was a coachman, he was a servant and then a coachman. This is the kitchen. Diana was one of the maids. If anybody's watching Downton Abbey, which has just started on Netflix, you can well imagine life in Barton Hall and the dinners in the dinner hall, in the dining room and the lounge, and the servants and the kitchen. If you had a spare 3.5 million rand, pounds, it would be really interesting to buy your ancestral home. I don't have 3.5 million pounds to spare. Google Books. I think we've all used Google for whatever reason, but I do wonder how many times we Google, or if you, in that search bar, if you type in Google Books, you go actually to a project by Google, started in 2004. So whatever that is, 18 years ago, they have scanned something like 40 million titles of books, and they've done OCR on those books. Most of them are not commercially available. You can't see them, you can't find the books commercially available. And obviously through OCR, there's many scanning areas. You know, depending upon the quality of the print, Walker could be Walter, because the K may come out differently. I would not search Google Books through the normal Google search engine. I'd go specifically to Google Books. The reason for that is if you search for Walker under the normal, it will be many, many hundreds of pages before you start finding references to Google Books. Why would I use Google Books? Here's a page from Google's Google Books. I'm looking for a Hearts Army list. You could just say Army list. This is the full view, any view. You will see there's 3 different types of views you can get. You can get the one where there's no preview, so you can't read that book. I would normally filter that out. There's no point in seeing that in your search, but you can see how you can find 1841 Hearts Army list, 1857, 1859, 1840, 1908. Many of them won't have a preview, but the important thing is some have a preview. In other words, it's got limited things, but others are fully scanned. So here is the Army list. I can search for page by page for the complete Army list in 1841. I'm not sure that Google Books would be a normal resource that we as family researchers would use. We'd probably go to the archives or somewhere like that for the Army list, whereas totally free of charge, I can go to the Army list, and in 1849, 1850, one of the persons I'm interested in is Charles Yelverton Belgay. Here he is in the 41st Regiment of the Foot. It gives me the details of the regiment, the army. Later on, I can see in other ones, he started off with an ensign. He ended up as adjutant and a major. The only source in finding this individual was Google Books. Very useful for old books and new books, but very useful old books which maybe are difficult. They're not, like you can see, you can do a full character search on these things. You can see where I've done Charles, and it's picked up all the entries of Charles. And because I tend to go from the known to the unknown, and the OCR is sometimes a bit dodgy. But once you've got him in 1 year, you can now trace through the various army lists to many other sources. Taking a breather, passenger lists. Passenger lists are very useful. You'll see that Find My Past has them for that period. Ancestry has those periods. There's no standard format for a passenger list. I'm looking for my father. You'll see that they stop in 1960. far as I know, there's no plans because of the 50-year rule to bring this further on. I won't suddenly find my past passenger lists for 1960 to 1970. I can find my father and myself. This slides out of context, but there's passenger liners. These are pictures from the web. These aren't pictures within the family. Sorry, it's out of order, that slide is. But here I can find my father and my mother. There's my Jeffrey Douglas Walker, Jeffrey Douglas. There's Alice, my mum, Alice Walker. There's me, and there's one of my sisters. It gives you the dates of birth, married or single, an address in the UK. Remember, we talked about Tranby Gardens in Woollerton, Nottingham. That was not my father's address. That's my grandfather's address. Occupation after he came out of the my dad was in the RAF, and he came out after the war, and there he is, produce buyer, cocoa buyer, and he was on the route to Ghana. Gives the date, the 12th of June 1958, and where my dad went, I did. And that is the inbound return trip on the sister line in April 1960, and you'll see my dad, my mum, me, and my sister. And there we go back out to Ghana, Gold Coast in 1960. There's my dad, my mum, myself, and my sister. Unfortunately, the records stop in the mid-1960s when they came back in 60, I can't remember, 61 or 62. Actually, I had another sister, Philippa, but the passenger records for inbound after the middle of 1960 are not available due to the 50-year rule. So passenger lists gives you addresses and gives you details that you may not have. I think passenger lists are what I would call secondary sources that most family researchers would use. eBay. Why do I use eBay? Why does anybody use eBay? Well, I've just talked on eBay. These are illustrations, which I don't buy the menus, but it gives you the menus from the ship, from the line in 1964. I use these things to illustrate my family history. I can remember getting a menu on SAA when we used to fly to and fro to the UK in the 1980s, but the menus were not as extensively artistic, and I use that word, as these menus from the 1960s. I think eBay gives a lot of illustrative examples that you can illustrate your research with. So there's a poster for the Cunard Elder Dempster line to and from West Africa. You can find routes, you can find passenger lists. You might, although I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath, you might find a passenger list which actually lists one of your ancestors. I find it interesting when I link to YouTube. Why would I use YouTube as a resource? Is to illustrate my family history. So here, if I click, there's a YouTube video, 1955, the male vote coming out from Liverpool to Accra in Ghana. For your sake, I won't actually play the whole thing, but this gives you what is life on board one of these liners, which my mum and dad would spend 2 weeks on, going off to Ghana and coming back. Somewhere in my distant memory, in my past, I can always remember my mum and dad talking about the greasy pole competitions. Now, using YouTube, I can actually get a better sense of what my parents meant by the greasy pole competitions. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'll spare you that. But it does show dances on board. It shows life on board that liner. I also, YouTube, downloading from YouTube, Princess Diana's wedding. I illustrate this because, yes, I'm quite a royalist. I went and the previous day on the Friday night before their wedding, we went to Hyde Park and we watched the fireworks. No, I didn't have a camera. I didn't have a video, but I can download from YouTube those images and that movies. We all have to be careful what we download from the internet, how we download it. But a trick I've found is if you add, dare I say, SS to the beginning of YouTube, like I've done there, it actually downloads the video to your computer. So you don't have to rely on, if you're replaying this video, you don't have to rely on that video, that link remaining live onto YouTube. You don't have to rely on Wi-Fi or the thing. I've downloaded that video. So for, I'm going to say ever and a day, that video is available in a digital format on my family history thing. And somewhere in this crowd is me, but you won't find me. But at least I know I was in that crowd. Very useful. And as I mentioned, eBay, going back, you can find nuggets, real nuggets to help your family research. I mentioned Gunningham's. They came out in 1911, 12, and 13. Here is a passenger list. No, it doesn't mention the Gunninghams. It's from a different year, but just maybe it will. There's a ticket for a third-class ticket. Again, not a Gunningham, on eBay. I don't know the individuals referred to, but it would be, I think, a remarkable find if you could find a ticket for one of your family members. But the beauty of the ticket is on the reverse, it has the terms and conditions, will tell you about the class. Terms and conditions is like, it's very interesting what they could and could not bring on board. Very interesting to see what was permitted and what was not permitted. And the Gunningham brothers traveled as third-class passengers. You see this from the passenger records. Third-class passengers, when you look at basically the lowest class of passenger. What's interesting is on the tickets, there's immigration steerage package tickets. Here's a 27-year-old man from Southampton visiting Natal. Water and provisions to be issued daily, to be supplied as per there. Duk, 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 duk. And then on a weekly allowance, the provisions allowed on this scale. These are the provisions provided by the transport company, the shipping company, to a third-class passenger in 1906. And that was for a week. This is to last a week. So I find it interesting to illustrate this. But one of the activities I did with my grandchildren was we actually, one afternoon, measured out a pound of oatmeal, 1 pound of peas, 1/4 pound, 1/4 pound of beef, 2 ounces of tea, 2 ounces of salt, laid that out onto the kitchen table, 8 ounces of rice, and that is what one passenger had to live off for a week. 8 ounces of raisins. It made my grandchildren, I'm going to say, appreciate much more what our ancestors went through as an activity that we gave them. I wouldn't know this if it wasn't for eBay. I don't know how, hopefully people are still interested. Probates and wills in the UK. It's a news service under the UK government website. There's the website address. But if you, dare I say, Google probate, wills, UK government, you'll get this gov. You must register, but it's free to register. So you can search 3 categories of wills, 1996 to present, 1858 to 1996, and the wills of soldiers who died as soldiers. You can download a copy of that will at £1.50 per will, and I'm going to say over the last year, I've downloaded quite a few. It's whatever, it's 30 Rand. And they say it's ready within 15 days to download that copy. My experience is it's actually ready within 3 working days. It's not immediate, but it's quite rapid. The caveat, you must get the relatives' permission if you want to publish them in any way. But there is a source for wills And remember that that could be very pertinent to your own research. It's, as I say, it's free to search. Here is a page, Bradshaw. I'm looking for, there was a Francis Bradshaw. It tells me the date of probate, the date of his death, tells me the registry, tells me the estate value of the estate value. And I can add that to my basket. I can pay £1.50, and I'm going to say 3 days later, maybe a week later, I can get a copy of that will, not only just from the probate registry. As we're getting, I know we're getting closer to the end. School, I got my father's school register certificate. You can find school educational records using Find My Past and Ancestry. There are, I would say, limited records. It's not a huge voluminous set of records, but it is growing. It's ongoing, the scanning of educational records for schools. As an offset, as I say, I'm a great believer in talking to my grandkids and my children. Everybody thinks that, well, going to school has been compulsory. Everybody goes to school. Well, in the UK, it was only compulsory from up to the age of 15 in 1947, just after the war. 1918, when my grandfather was, how old would he have been? He would have been 9. It was only compulsory up to the age of 14. So if my grandchild, when they get to 14, I'd actually say, well, if you're complaining about the schoolwork, your great-grandfather, grandmother, actually would be lucky if she was still going to school at the age of 15. She would be actually out to work. And I illustrate this in 1893, it was only compulsory at the age of 11. And in 1880, it was only compulsory for ages between 5 and 10. I use this type of background information when I'm talking to the family, grandchildren, to place it in the context of their schooling, because schooling was not always compulsory. It's certainly not individually a right. The school records can be very useful. There is my Alice Gibbons. This is from Stockton, Middlesbrough, northeast England. There's my Alice Gibbons there. It gives her father's name. It gives an address. It gives an exact date of birth. And it also gives a date of the leaving, when they left. So even in 1881 or 1891, the census doesn't give an exact date of birth. It doesn't necessarily fill in all the details. Remember, this would be like mid between two censuses, 1881, 1891. So school registers, as they become more and more available online, provide greater detail, not something to be overlooked. Newspapers, I already alluded to those. Newspapers are more and more online. I think when you look at the date of a newspaper, what was the news in 1941? It sounds illogical for me to talk about what was the news in 1941. But it gives you a greater insight into what, I'm going to say, the world was thinking about, or what was England thinking about in those years. What is interesting is actually 9th of August, 10 days ago, 10 days, 15 days, 20 days ago, Find My Past put 1 million historical newspaper pages online free of charge. Just recently, as I say, 9th of August. The British Library, you can register, you can browse, but now this expanding project between Find My Past and the British Library is making it more and more accessible. You might not be able to read this, but over the next 4 years, they're going to put 2.7 million pages free of charge online. You can find all sorts of nuggets in newspapers. Again, looking at my Sydney Bartondale Walker, I can find he was the chief clerk at the Barclays Arkwright Street branch of Barclays, but due to the retirement on the 1st of July 1950, he would become the manager of the Senaton branch in Nottingham. I can find it's always, as I say, very useful to have, especially a double-barreled initials, SB Walker. Here he is representing the St. Mary's Masonic Lodge, at the funeral of one of his colleagues. And here he is in Nottingham. It adds bridges, it adds what it's like, where he was, geographic interests all the time. Newspapers, very useful source to build on things. So, obviously we have obituaries, we have births, marriages and death notices, but just the normal news can give you a lot of insights. And as I say, there's 1 million pages now just being accessible free of online. Thanks to newspapers, my Thomas Walker, here is his, it's not my Thomas Walker, it's his son, Thomas Walker, my great-grandfather. On his 60th wedding anniversary, I have a picture of him, which I don't otherwise have, in the newspaper. So I think newspapers are really useful to look at. I have other cases where I have ancestors which were, I'm going to say, killed by falling off a trolley cart. I have another one where he was Ainge. He was I don't know what you would like to call him. He was in charge of Dartmouth Castle, which sounds very, very posh as a castle, but he was a retired artillery officer, and he had come up through the ranks from the Royal Artillery, and he was, through the newspapers, introduced to Prince Albert on their visit to Dartmouth. I know we're going to come to the end, sorry. Vehicle registration. Why would I want to know about vehicle registration? Here is a picture of a car. I know it's on my wife's side. Let's not ask why they were visiting the ship in, but I can tell through the registration number on this vehicle, I can look up the date of the registration of the vehicle, and I can look up when it was first registered, etc. It gives me detail. These are free resources online. And I think this is the final slide. One service that I've used is the Salvation Army. They do not do family research on your behalf. But if you have lost contact with family member, and remember, this is a service which is available across the world internationally. It takes time. It's not something which takes a month. Their aim is to try to reconnect families. Costs a lot of money, £45. But if it's reconnecting a family, maybe £45 is not necessary. I believe in family. I think a lot of us doing research believes in the power of family. It's not a family research resource. It's a family reconnecting. And the family, the family member needs to give permission. So the Salvation Army won't give you their details without permission. So and in my case, I know of a family member, a Wilson. I know they emigrated to Canada, but after that, I don't know them. I can look through Ancestry and I can look at, but if they're not interested in family history, they may not be, for example, on Ancestry. But the Salvation Army has access to a lot more resources than I do as an individual. And I've used them to reconnect with cousins, remove cousins, and rebuild those relationships with family. I think that's the last slide. So if I stop sharing the screen, are there questions? Are there observations, comments, whatever?
I thought it was fantastic. I was so impressed to see such an incredibly detailed timeline. And I'm always talking about timelines, but it was incredible to see such great detail for each individual that you've chosen. I know that these are specifically for your family, but it really blew me away. It was fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
I'll ask a couple of questions. You mentioned in the UK records a wedding recorded that happened in France. Would British people who had moved to South Africa also have their weddings recorded in UK records?
Not necessarily. In my case, I knew it was done at the British consulate in France. So if that wedding was in the British consulate, for example, both my kids, and I know other examples because I've done other trees, their births were registered. We registered them with the British consulate.
Okay, right. So that was, yeah.
So they wouldn't, the British consulate wouldn't recognise births unless they were actually already registered.
Right.
But if you had I don't know, in my case, for example, we emigrated in 1982 and we registered at the birth because we didn't know we would still be here in 2022 or 21. Both of our kids, we registered their births at the British consulate here in Joburg. Therefore, both my children carry British passports as well as South African passports.
Yeah, okay, lovely. And then you mentioned the UK passenger list from 1878 to 1960. What about ships that came out earlier than that?
They do exist. I didn't see a slide. I need to look for a slide. The National Archives, I wonder if I can.
For lists before that, all the arrivals are listed in the government gazettes of the day, as far as I know.
On the National Archives, I just want to.
And Natalie, that would be the South African National Government Gazette.
That's right. There are two repositories, one at the archives in Cape Town, and of course the State Library keeps them as well, and in Pretoria.
But departures from the UK would also be registered from the UK. So although you would have the arrivals here and departures from here, the converse is also true. You would have departures registered as passengers leaving the UK. So that to me would be, apart from looking at Ancestry and Find My Past, which have these passenger lists, I would look very, very carefully at the National Archives. At the moment, all the records which are digitized are free to download. So you can look for passenger lists. So a ship leaving the UK, coming to South Africa. Again, my knowledge of South African ancestry is very poor. I'm sorry and I apologize. But there were a number of resettlement schemes or settlement schemes in the 1820s, 1850s, etc. Those records would, I think, be available in the National Archives.
They are, and a lot of them are online as well.
Yes, that's what and they're free to download. You know, they will digitize and free to download.
Great, thank you. And then one more question. Say my family was in Natal in the late 1800s. How would you find what newspapers were published in Pietermaritzburg or Durban or whatever?
I think I would first of all go to the British museums online, because remember Natal was still, and when I say this, nobody should take offense, was still British, you know? So I would expect to still find a lot of Natal, a lot of Cape Province newspapers, gazettes in the British Museum.
Lovely. So that's the British Museum online.
Yes.
Great.
And then you might be lucky enough that would be part of the current Find My Past million pages of newspapers.
So it's the Find My Past part of the British Library, the British Museum.
British Library. I mean the British Museum. Sorry, British Museum. You're right.
So
a lot of the Natal newspapers are listed on EGSSA.
Okay. Oh, thanks a lot.
Natalie, I see there's a question on the chat from Angela looking for a tobacconist in Woolwich, 1880-1903. Obviously, I think they would be in a trade directory. I think they would be both. If they were a tobacconist, they could be both in a trade directory and voters list, and obviously in the 1881, 91, and 1901 census.
Absolutely, yes. I've got several of them. You can see my trade directories. I've got lots of them for the UK, and I've got plenty for South Africa. I think my earliest one is 1828.
Yeah, so, you know, a tobacconist in South Africa, in the UK, is probably going to be a tobacconist when he arrives in South Africa.
Yeah.
Of course, he might become an agriculturalist, but he's probably a tobacconist. And the chances would be, the easiest way, I think, to find him would be in the UK trade directory. And as I say, I don't know, but the trade directories in South Africa online, there's a few, but yeah, I think the trade directory and the voters list would be a good source to find out where did he go in South Africa.
Nigel, thank you again from all of us. You've given us great insight into how to add some unusual records to our family trees. Thank you so much.